Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. We are the slow reading virtual book club that talks about works by Welty, alternated with works by authors connected to Welty in some way. As you know, we are reading and discussing The Optimist Daughter, Eudora Welty's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel in honor of the 50th anniversary of Welty receiving the Pulitzer Prize for this title. We have already read and discussed the Pulitzer Prize-winning version of the story, and now we're going to be discussing parts 1 and 2 of the previous version that ran in the New Yorker in 1969. And I must apologize to you. In one communication, I said we'd be discussing part 1. That was a mistake. We'll actually be discussing parts 1 and 2 today. So if you read ahead, feel free to discuss parts 1 and 2. And I apologize for my mistake. All right, that said, just a few little quick housekeeping. If you're new, my name is Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden. And I'm so happy to say that our discussion will be moderated by Dr. Suzanne Mars. She is Welty's friend and biographer and professor emerita of Millsaps College. If you need to comment or have a question, just look at the bottom of your screen. There's a reactions button. And if you click the reactions button, you can raise your hand. And Suzanne and I will be watching for your hands to be raised. And also keep an eye on the chat. There's usually a really good conversation going on in the chat as well. So thank you all for your comments and your participation. I'm so glad to be back with you. Thanks to Jennifer Rose for hosting last week. And with that said, Dr. Mars, where would you like to begin today's discussion?
All right. Well, I'm going to start by quoting Eudora Welty about the New Yorker version of her novel, of the New Yorker version of the story that did become the novel. And she said about the change from story to novel, I hope it was simply more what it was meant to be. I hope it was simply more what it was meant to be. So we're going to talk about additions that come in the novel. We're going to talk about cuts to the story that come into the novel. We'll talk about revisions, changes of language, of descriptions, of text. So I thought we might start off by making a list of what you think are the major items that we could discuss. Don't talk about them first. Let's just make a list of what you think we ought to discuss. Does anyone want to give me one item they think we should discuss? Beverly.
I think the beginning is one thing we need to discuss. The beginnings of the two works. All
right, good. Thank you. John, what do you think?
Can I, the title?
The title. The same title. Yeah, keeps that. Okay, Teresa.
I think that we ought to talk about the use of expanded conversations. For example, in the pre-novel, there was a lot more conversations by the characters.
All right, we'll talk about that. Anything else? Harriet.
Yeah, I'm thinking about pairings. Expanding is one kind of change, but paring things down and sharpening them by moving might be distracting. I'm also thinking about a couple of specific things like the detective novels that are in the finished version that are not in this version. I'm thinking about changes in where she makes a break between section 1 and section 2, and how section 2 is focuses on the bridesmaids in the finished version, where it doesn't in the first. Other things. Am I right that she doesn't kill off Faye's family? In this
You're exactly right. She kills them off in the novel, but not in the, it's okay. So Faye's family, good.
I'll stop there.
That was actually where I was planning to start. Jo Ellen.
And Faye does not kill off her family because Laurel does not make the gesture of having a conversation in the hotel. And that's probably the most significant change in section 1, which I'm mostly thinking about. The funniest are some things like the baby in a diaper and mask running around.
Okay, let's can I list that as Mardi Gras? Yeah. Go ahead, Jo Ellen. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, that's okay. Since I'm still on though, I'll mention one crucial change to the nurse's report when she's yelling, she laid hands on him in the second, or that is the first section. She adds every mortal night, there's a to-do. This time, so that emphasizes Faye's role, and Welty decided to cut that.
John, you have another one?
Yes. I'm going to say two things: the evolution from a short story to a novel, and the themes and how they develop. And all right.
Let me say, John, that you are speaking with the voice of William Maxwell there, who said what he felt was that most of the changes were designed to move into a new genre, to the genre of the novel from the story. Yeah. All right, any others? I'm going to add some. I want to talk about the expanded role for Adele and Missouri, and the intersection of their Adele and Missouri material, so that you have a kind of triumvirate here of Laurel, Adele, and Missouri. So I'd really like to talk about that. And I thought we might talk about the cemetery and the descriptions of the cemetery. I've got a whole long list here. The timing of Faye's entry into the visitation. And I wanted to ask you all if you thought the references to Addie in part 1 called to mind As I Lay Dying, and if that might be something we should talk about, since we've talked about Faulkner, but that's a kind of, I'm gonna put that one on the back burner. So let me start with Faye and her family. And as Joellen was saying, Laurel does not come to see Faye at the Hibiscus, and so Faye doesn't tell about the death of her family, but in the novel version, she does. Excuse me, I'm getting a phone call from someone I don't know, and I've now put my phone on mute, I hope. So if we start with that, why add that? Why add the visit that Laurel and Faye have at the Hibiscus? Why add Faye's claim that her family is dead? And what does that tell us about, how does that set up for what we know about Laurel and what we know about Faye as the novel, and John's question about the thematic development of the novel? How does that play into the thematic development of the novel as we're going forward? All right. Anyone want to start us off there? Yeah, Beverly.
I think it makes Laurel a more sympathetic human character, in that she's making an effort to get to know her stepmother as they're going through this horrible thing together, and is sort of reaching out to her to, she doesn't really know much about her. She's been married to her daddy for a year and a half, but to me, it makes her look, I think it makes her look more human. I think you would want to know those things. And I think that the effort, it also makes Faye look a whole lot worse.
Okay.
But making the effort is important, I think.
Okay, so you would say humanizing Laurel, and perhaps making Faye less sympathetic as we develop, as the story develops into a novel. Harriet.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the way in which a lot of the changes in the final version show Laurel's connectedness to people. her connectedness to the bridesmaids, her connectedness to, as opposed to Faye's lack of connection to her family, or at least it looks that way. That is, the gesture of killing people off suggests that she's trying to limit relationships rather than extend them. And I'm thinking about the remark, that I guess it's Miss Adele who says, no, it might be Mrs. Chisholm who says, yeah, it is Mrs. Chisholm who says, you don't have chick or child to Laurel. But in fact, she has a lot of connection in this community that is brought out in the way in which Welty kind of reorganizes the second section, and it's foreshadowed, I think, by this killing off of Faye as a contrast, as a foil to Laurel.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that, one of the big revelations that Laurel comes to at the end is that life is nothing but the continuity of its love. And Faye, in killing off her family, is really cutting off any idea of continuity of love in her life. Now, her family, if we're going to give them credit, do show up for the funeral, but they come because Major Bullock has invited them. And in the story, he does it on his own, but in the novel, it's because Judge McKelvey has provided for that. And Faye hasn't invited any of them to her wedding. So that there is that sense of her cutting herself off from any sense of continuity of love. And Laurel, and the importance of that to Laurel, although we don't see it fully yet, I think. Pearl, I'll shut up.
On the other hand, it also could help us to empathize with Faye because she's without family. This is early on. We don't know that she's lying.
Right. It's not till part 2 that we know she's lied. Yeah.
Right. And so at the moment, if she says here her new husband, older husband's in the hospital, the daughter shows up also and tries to claim him back, and she's about to lose, well, her husband's in the hospital. So he is her only family if her family's dead. And at the same time, I think it foreshadows, or it's up the whole theme about who you are if you do not have family, if your family is dead, because this is what's going to be happening to Laurel. She's lost her husband, she's lost her mother, and now she's about to lose her father. So I think it's a good thing to add there because it complicates, which is what the novel has to do versus the short story. It complicates it.
Right. And Laurel, what she's ultimately going to find is she does have these connections, but it's ultimately going to be memory. It's memory that sustains. And Laurel is going to have to gain access to her memory. She's shut it down in good part and framed it. And so that's important. So Faye claiming sympathy, there at the first, when we find out in the second section that she's lied about it, she's going to lose that, whatever sympathy she might have claimed, I think. Jessica and then Teresa.
Well, I just wanted to say that I saw an interesting question in the chat brought by John Browning, just a more fundamental question of why we think Welty needed to expand this story. Yeah. He says he feels the story was a success in terms of writing and publication. And the question is, why do we think she was compelled to return to it and change the form?
Well, part of it was urging of her editor at the New Yorker, William Maxwell, of her agent, that they thought the book deserved separate publication. And when she went to think about, she resisted that for a while. In fact, she even wanted to have it in a collection of stories so as not to, I think, call attention to the autobiographical basis of the novel. But they had convinced her that it was worthy of separate publication. But when she thought about it as separate publication, and this is what William Maxwell thought, she thought if it's going to be a novel, it has to be expanded. And she said, I want it. And I think it's also that she thought she needed to develop certain key ideas and concepts and characters more fully if it were going to be a novel, because the short story is much more a taut kind of construction. And the novel does demand that sort of expansion, I think. Not padding, I hope it was simply more what it was meant to be. And I think it's also Eudora, as she's working on it, thinking, how can I make this better? How can I make it more convincing? How can I develop ideas more fully? So I think that's what's going on. Teresa.
I think that what struck me was that in the revision, there's so much talking going on, and the talking is informative and it's interesting, it's catty, but in the final version, there's so much less talking, and Laurel herself talks very little, yet she has these relationships with people that are based, I think, a lot on listening and her feelings. And as you said, ultimately memory. So I think that I'm kind of off topic, but so much of this is the thoughts in her mind and what she's going through, and what in turn Eudora Welty gets you to think about in terms of your relationship with people. So I think that Eudora Welty is really prompting us to think about ourselves and our relationships with people and how we deal with love and loss.
All right, thank you, Teresa. And I want to point out that cutting conversation in part one, Laurel, when she's in the hospital, phones home, and she makes a call to her office, and then she makes a call to a friend. That call to the friend is cut. And in the story version, in Chicago, when she gets a call from her father, she had been out with a friend to the theater. That gets cut. So that in part one, we see her more and more isolated. I think in part two, we see that isolation breaking down. And I think I want to stress not just the bridesmaids, not just the community, but especially Adele in Missouri when we come to that. Jo Ellen.
I just wanted to note that definitely not padding from the New Yorker version to the 1972. But there are two things that I didn't mention before. I just want to throw out, we don't need to talk about them a lot right now. But at the end, when Laurel goes into the waiting room, before we meet the Dalzells, there's any of that, she, in her conversation, tells Faye, which she does not do in 1972, that not only does she think he's dying, she believes her father's already dead, which is really hard on Faye. Her behavior that follows that, with all of the business with the Dalzells, eating supper and Archie Lee and all of that stuff is, just wrenching. It's so extremely inappropriate. But also she lets up on Faye's family a little bit. The section with Bubba where she sort of is hard on Baptists. But
she's
Bubba,
pretty hard on Baptist, all right.
and linking Bubba to the KKK. After the Whitecap story, he smiles. And it sounds like the Klan was only lower class, which was of course not true. He jams on Medicare, the reason for all their problems. So she takes out some of the political stuff. And so anyway, those are a couple of big changes, I think, that help make us a little bit more sympathetic or open us a little more, perhaps, to Faye and her family.
All right, good. Harriet.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a couple of things. One is the paring down and the way in which it's sharpened. I'm thinking of removing Mrs. Martello's remarks about every night because the focus isn't on Mrs. Martello's experience, but rather on and so I'm thinking about how taking things out sharpens, and she has a better idea of what she wants to do with the scene in the novel version. I'm also thinking about Teresa's remark that Laurel doesn't say much and thinks a lot. I'm thinking about how many of Welty's female narrators are that don't speak but think, that we're in their heads and we see their reflection on what's happening around them rather than hearing their voice interacting. And I'm also thinking about I wondered about trauma. That is, I wondered if one of the reasons in response to John's question about Welty's willingness to continue work on this piece is that she's also working on something traumatic. I mean, I feel very much in the sharpening of the Mrs. Martello scene in the hospital, the sense of abuse, of laying hands on him, that she's something happened in the hospital that, we've talked about her letter to about the closeness of the scene to what actually happened with her brother and sister-in-law. And my sense that she's working on traumas of different kinds, more than usual. This is not only more autobiographical, but it has more to do with working on a year of trauma.
And let's remember that The Optimist Daughter as a story was written in 1967. It was finished in 67. It's not until 1971 that she starts really seriously turning it into a novel. And so she's had, since the events of the death of her mother and brother, 5 years. And so there's more perspective here to bring to the event, less in the first flush of grief and more perspective, I think. Yeah, John.
Just a couple of things, or what's going to be more. One thing is, seems, and this is just from, seems to me that her use of the birds comes much earlier in the novel than it, and I don't remember any of that in the opening. And of course, she's mainly in the hospital and in New Orleans, but the images, not only of the birds, but the hands are worked in much earlier. And I saw that there's a reference to dreams a couple of times in the short story, and I don't remember that being in the novel. And the emphasis is on, to me, memories and reconciliation and love. And then finally, one thing I was very surprised that, and I didn't realize I was supposed to restrict it, and I read the entire story yesterday, and I was very surprised that the title to the story was The Optimist Daughter, because I thought that in the four main characters in the book, in the short story, I thought the least important was Laurel, and I was surprised that she would get billing as the Optimist Daughter. But to me in the novel, that is a very appropriate title. But I think it could have been given if it had been given a different title, I wouldn't have been surprised.
Well, she did debate about the title. That was up for debate till the very last minute, pretty much. And one title that they had thought about was Poor Eyes. Another was An Only Child. Poor Eyes doesn't focus so much on Laurel, but An Only Child certainly would have. But I still think the focus is on Laurel in the short story. But we can talk about that too, John, later on. I want to mention one other thing in conjunction with Faye and her claim that her family is dead, and this whole effort to keep her focus on the future and not to have this kind of sense of continuity with the past. I think Laurel is pretty much stopped in time, not living in the past because she's blocked her memory to a certain extent, but not going to the future, not living fully in the present. But in the short story, it's Laurel who goes and starts the clock on the mantle in part 2. She goes and starts the clock. But in the novel, no, it's her friends have started the clock. So Laurel is not ready to, at this point, to really to cope with time and time's movement, I think. And so that little detail, I think, is an important one. Let's see what else you all wanted to talk about. What about, well, can we talk about my my one, Adele in Missouri. Let's talk about Adele and Missouri and how they figure more prominently in the novel than in the story. Am I the only one who thinks this? Somebody gonna help me out? We don't have to talk about it. I'll drive it down your throats at some point. Okay, Joe Ellen.
Well, the easiest answer is that there's no story about the fire. We don't get Missouri's backstory in the New Yorker version, so we know much less about her. And which also tells us less about Laurel's father.
All right, so so we don't have the story of Missouri as the witness in the trial, the got shot witness. We don't have the story of how the judge has brought her into his own house after that. So that is gone, and where she's making the fire at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I forgot to mention in relation to the fire that we understand, because she's in the room, that she's hearing the discussion about her also. So it's an even more significant scene.
And it's also at that point that Adele says, and Laurel is worried that she's hearing it. And we're pretty sure that she's not happily hearing it because she's poking at that fire and sparks are going everywhere. Those sparks might be her own feelings about being condescended to, being the subject of this kind of patronizing conversation where they're sort of making fun of her. And Laurel doesn't like it. And Adele says, Laurel, I think people rarely see themselves in others' conversations, but I think we know that Missouri is seeing her. So that's one big addition. Let's look at that on, I think it's 931. The crowd of men were still at it behind the screen. Clint's hunting a witness, some of the usual trouble, and this Negro girl says it's him and me that saw it. He's a witness and I's a got shot witness. They laughed. There's two kinds, all right, says Clint, and I know which to take. She's the got shot witness, I'll take her. He could see the funny side to everything. He brought her here afterwards and kept her safe under his own roof, Laurel said, under her breath to Miss Adele, who had come in from the door now. It would be too late for any more callers before the funeral. I don't know what the funny side was. It was Missouri, wasn't it, said Miss Adele. And listening, said Laurel, for Missouri herself was just then lit up by a shower of sparks. Down on her knees before the fire, she was poking the big log. I always pray people won't recognize themselves in the speech of others, Miss Adele murmured, and I don't think very often they do. The log shifted like a sleeper in bed, and light flared over all the room, in the room. Mr. Pitts was revealed in their midst as though by a spotlight, in the act of consulting his wristwatch. What's happening isn't real, said Laurel low. The ending of a man's life on earth is very real indeed, Miss Adele said. So there is that scene added at this point in the novel. So it's, there is Laurel offended by this kind of laughing. And what is funny about that? Missouri has witnessed a crime. She has been shot. The judge thinks she needs protection. And in the recollection of the Bar Association, whether rightly or wrongly, it's become a laughing matter. It's not funny. And Laurel is sensitive on Missouri's behalf. And Adele is too. And Adele is trying to comfort Laurel and to point out that these people are having their own troubles in dealing with the situation, and they're trying to tell jokes or turn things into a joke as a way of escaping, I think, grief. Yeah, Cheryl.
That scene in contrast with, remember how frustrated Laurel was listening to the lawyers in the other room basically embellish the judge's life actions. Yes. Laurel wanted them to tell it real, to what what did the judge really do? What did he really represent? And this scene with Missouri is who the judge really was, right? Without any hyperbole
right.
or embellishment. Like that's the sincerity, or that's the kind of story, real thing that meant something to Laurel. That's all.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. That's right, I think. Notice too that when Laurel comes home in the novel, Adele is much more central, and Adele is there at the end of that arrival at home, in the kitchen, cleaning up the dishes, having a conversation with Laurel. Then Adele arrives the next day, and she's the one standing at the front door letting people in. She has a real function here, and then she comes to stand by Laurel. Missouri is the one that tells Laurel that the judge always liked to spoil Faye, and then Laurel asks her, she doesn't tell her, she asks her if she'll take up the breakfast. And they both have a sense of the same sense of loss. And it's into Missouri's arms that Laurel walks to be embraced. It's Missouri and Adele and Laurel who are together watching the coffin leave the house and go to the church. And it's Missouri, Adele, and Laurel again together at the end of the section when the funeral is over. Faye has left the house, and Missouri has taken Adele's place in the kitchen here, and Adele then, when she hears Missouri in the kitchen, she goes on home. But we have the intersection of the three women, and I think, to me, Adele is one of the most sympathetic characters in the novel, one of the most astute characters associated with Laurel. Missouri is the other one who is, who really has a lot of common sense, who understands the judge perhaps better than anyone else in his relationship to Faye. And here is Laurel allied to these two women from her childhood, this kind of closeness. All three are sort of outsiders. Adele is the unmarried school teacher, Missouri, the Black woman working for the white family, and Laurel, the daughter who has left. And so the three outsiders who are sharing this together. And I think it gives us a basis to judge Laurel, to judge her development, that they stand as sort of guidepost in doing that. But it also suggests the kind of connections she has that are very powerful ones and enduring ones. What do y'all think? Am I off on a hobby horse here? Am I riding my hobby horse? Okay. Jessica.
I see that in the chat, Pearl is asking if there is an autobiographical connection for Miss Adele. I thought that was a good question.
I don't know, Pearl. What do you think?
Not that I know of, but, I'm just thinking so much else is autobiographical or switched over, changing of things. So who were, is it like a Charlotte Capers type person or a Jane Reed Petty? Who did Welty let into her life after her parents, after her mother died and her brother died?
Well, I think Charlotte certainly was a very close friend who also would share some kind of qualities of Miss Adele. And ultimately, Jane Petty, Patty Black would be characters like this. I think maybe even the Swearingen sisters at this time were very close to her, so that she had friendships powerful. And then there were the men, Frank Lyle, John Robinson, Nash Berger, those men who were so important to her as well, but not here in that a lot of the men were far flung. The men weren't here in Jackson the way those women were, But she would identify, I think, pretty clearly with that sense of the close friendships being sustaining. Teresa.
I think that the relationship that Laurel had with Missouri and with Adele was an unspoken relationship. It was a relationship where they could look into each other's eyes and see what the other person was thinking without having to articulate it. And I think that's what what makes it so important. Again, Laurel's not a big communicator. She feels deeply, but she doesn't need to talk about it, to brag about it, to share about it. And neither do the other ladies.
I think that's
Especially
right.
Missouri.
There's a kind of unspoken communication going on, a powerful communication, but not always verbal. No. All right, Pearl.
Isn't Adele the generation of Laurel's parents?
She is.
Okay, so she's watched this whole thing. She's been friends with Becky, but she's also befriended the judge all this time. So both Missouri and Adele know the entire history, not just of Laurel, but of the two marriages, of the earlier death, of the coming of Faye, and they've been very observant, and that leads to their silence, I think, because they know better than to make a judgment on it out loud.
Yeah. And it also suggests something about the continuity of love too, doesn't it? That they are emblems of that continuity. And that this is a continuity that transcends age, it transcends race, so which makes it even more powerful. Okay, well, let's do some other things. What about the opening? Beverly wanted to talk about the opening. I think that's a good thing for us to do. You want to read? I'll read it and then we'll talk about it. Here's, well, let me get the story first. If I can find it where it's, here we go. Out of Chicago, suddenly here in New Orleans, Laurel Hand sat inside the windowless room where her father waited on the doctor who would examine his eyes. Judge McKelvey was a tall, heavy man of 71 who customarily wore his glasses on a ribbon. Holding them in his hand now, he sat raised on the throne-like chair above the doctor's stool, flanked on one side by Laurel and on the other side by his second wife, Faye. Dr. Cortland on the dot crossed the room in long steps and shook hands with Judge McKelvey and Laurel. He had to be introduced to Faye, who had been married to Judge McKelvey for only a year and a half. Then the doctor was on the stool with his heels hung over the rung. He lifted his face in appreciative attention as though it were he who had waited in New Orleans for Judge McKelvey in order to give the judge a present, or for the judge to bring him one. And then in the novel, a nurse held the door open for them, Judge McKelvey going first, then his daughter Laurel, then his wife Faye. They walked into the windowless room where the doctor would make the examination. Judge McKelvey was a tall, heavy man of 71 who customarily wore his glasses on a ribbon. Holding them in his hand now, he sat on the raised throne-like chair above the doctor's stool, flanked by Laurel on one side and Faye on the other. Laura McKelvey Hand was a slender, quiet-faced woman in her middle 40s, her hair still dark. She wore clothes of an interesting cut and texture, although her suit was wintry for New Orleans and had a wrinkle down the skirt. Her dark blue eyes looked sleepless. Faye, small and pale in her dress with the gold buttons, was tapping her sandaled foot. It was a Monday morning of early March. New Orleans was out of town for all of them. Dr. Cortland, on the dot, crossed the room in long steps and shook hands with Judge McKelvey and Laurel. He had to be introduced to Faye, who had been married to Judge McKelvey for only a year and a half. Then the doctor was on the stool with his heels hung over the rung. He lifted his face in appreciative attention, as though it were he who had waited in New Orleans for Judge McKelvey in order to give the judge a present, or for the judge to bring him one. Okay, so those two start rather differently. Beverly, what did you stand out for you?
I think that the New Yorker piece makes Laurel look more like an outsider because it starts with her being from Chicago. And we don't have in this first part of the novel anything about Chicago, that she lives in Chicago. So I think that I think that the New Yorker story makes her look a little more like an outsider all along anyway, because the relationships aren't developed in the same way that they are in the novella. But I think starting out with that she's from Chicago, she's we have her whole name here, so we know she's been married before. We don't know anything about that yet. But I think that she looks, I think she's more prominent than Faye in this introduction, but I think it's also evident that she is from somewhere else now.
Well, the first words of any story are important, and the first ones in the New Yorker are out of Chicago. So there is that focus on that. Now, Harriet? Are you, Harriet?
Trying to unmute. Yeah. I was just going to say that I feel the presence of physical description of three characters in the changed version, as she knows. She knows what detail too to kind of select to set up what's coming later. Things like the brocade cloth or Laurel's fabric, and its complexity. But she makes all three characters important with physical description, as now we're going to focus on not just the judge's story, but the three of them.
Yeah, I think the physical descriptions are really telling to me. The clothes that Laurel wears versus the clothes that Faye wears. We've had the description of the judge before. Now we've got Faye and Laurel added. Pearl?
I don't understand why she would keep that last piece, which so then makes it very important, about Judge McKelvey in order to give the judge a present or for the judge to bring him one. I mean, it's an odd thing. I have to stop and think, well, what does she mean by that? And what is she trying to mean by that? But since she keeps it, it must be important, or something she really liked.
All right, so it's in both versions. It's not changed. And the line is, he lifted his face, this is Nate Cortland, in appreciative attention, as though it were he who had waited in New Orleans for Judge McKelvey in order to give the judge a present or for the judge to bring him one. I know Harriet and I think, disagree on this. I think Harriet is pretty down on Cortland as a doctor, but to me, there is a kind of effort to see him in his humanity as the man who the judge has helped and who is really welcoming, as sometimes doctors are not. I've been watching Doc Martin, so I know about doctors who don't welcome their patients. And this is the opposite of Doc Martin here. No, I think there's
true. That gives the connection.
Yeah, that connection with home is important. Yeah, Pearl, did you? And then Harriet. We're not hearing you, Pearl.
Oh, sorry. It gives the connection between.
We still can't hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, well, I'll just speak to the rest of you there for a
second. You're still muted. Okay, we'll let Harriet go, and then we'll come back to Pearl. Hopefully,
so we can hear Pearl. Suzanne,
now you're muted, Harriet.
Oh no, we can.
Are you all hearing everyone, and I'm not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, I'm muted. Okay.
All right. So I was just trying to say.
Can you all hear me?
Now.
Yes. Yeah.
It's your microphone. You're not muted, probably.
But now you're all set.
I'm trying. I'm sorry.
Your reading it again shows, Suzanne, that this is establishing the connection between the past.
Now try again. See if I can hear you.
We're talking.
The past of Judge McKelvey with.
I have hearing aids. I'm going to take them off.
Everybody else has heard my point. I'll let Harriet go.
Suzanne, I think if it's not the hearing aid, click on the mic. Well, I guess you can't hear me, so I can't give her directions. Okay. I don't know. I was just thinking
you better take over from me.
How interesting it is what details Welty keeps and which ones she loses. I think Suzanne is misreading me. I don't think that Dr. Portland is a bad doctor. I do think there's something really interesting going on with Welty's.
Jessica, I'm gonna log off and come back.
Okay.
Good. With Welty's treatment of doctors throughout her fiction, and how sometimes they're comic figures and sometimes they're killers. And sometimes but the relationship, I think, here is what's emphasized in that gift-giving detail that she keeps. But I'm also just really interested in some of the details that she cuts are wonderful details that are not to the point that as much as the ones that she adds, but they're still wonderful details. So it's really interesting to see her work. Deciding on which details are the ones she needs and which ones she can lose.
All right, I'm admitting Suzanne Mars again. We'll see what happens when she comes back. Thank you.
All right, can anyone hear me? Can I hear you?
I can hear you.
Harriet, are you? I can't hear you.
Suzanne, and you can't hear me. Okay. I'm going to message you.
Yeah.
All right. I can't hear a thing, so I don't know what's wrong.
I'm thinking
Send you a message.
If she clicks on her microphone and makes sure that she's checked her computer microphone.
Now I've got music playing. Now let me see if I can stop that. Okay.
But we couldn't think we could do this whole thing without some technological issues, right?
Well, I'm sorry I was the source of it. I apologize. Abjectly. No. Okay, I want to hear Harriet and Pearl if you all haven't already finished with their versions.
I think we have, yeah.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah, nothing of interest or importance happened while you were gone.
Well, we'll catch you up later.
All right. Well, I hope somebody mentioned that Laurel is, of course, a designer of fabrics, and so we have her clothes, and Faye's gold buttons and sandaled foot are certainly telling details about her. So that all come out previously.
No.
Yeah. So I think marks of class, marks of profession in their descriptions. Yeah. All right. Okay, anything else about the introductory section here that we want to say? Shall we go on to another one? What about the Mardi Gras scene at the end of part 1? And the changes. And Joellen was pointing out one of them, that there is a Faye's response to the Mardi Gras is a little different here than it was, than it would be in the novel. And I'll give Joellen first crack at this one.
I don't remember what I said about that. Sorry.
You're going to remember in just a minute when I read it.
Okay. Maybe you're mixing me up with someone.
I hope not. I'm counting on you.
Wasn't it the baby with the diaper?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Laurel was still gearing herself to the time things took. It was slow going through the streets. There were many waits. Now and then the driver had to shout from the wheel before they could proceed. Once Faye grabbed Laurel's arm as she would have grabbed any stranger's. I saw a man, and he was dressed up like a skeleton, and his date was in a long white dress with snakes for hair, holding up a bunch of lilies, coming down the steps of that house like they were just starting out. Was that the carnival? Laurel heard a band playing and another band moving in on top of it. She heard the crowd noise, the unmistakable sounds of hundreds of thousands of people blundering. I saw a man in Spanish moss, a whole suit of Spanish moss, all by himself on the sidewalk. He was vomiting, said Faye. This here is Mardi Gras night, said the driver. Before we could get out of that hospital, I saw a little baby running around loose by the emergency entrance in a diaper, dressed up in his own mask. Faye was weeping, both prattling and weeping, as if it were possible to be at once both the child and its comforter. When they reached there, they found that the carnival was at the Hibiscus too. And that's pretty different from the version, somewhat different from the version that comes in the novel, where we read this. Faye grabbed Laurel's arm as she would have grabbed any stranger's. I saw a man, and he was dressed up like a skeleton, and his date was in a long white dress with snakes for hair, holding up a bunch of lilies, coming down the steps of that house like they're just starting out. Then she cried out again, the longing or the anger of her whole life, all in her voice at one time. Is it the carnival? And then we have Laurel hearing the band playing, and then Faye says, I saw a man in Spanish moss, a whole suit of Spanish moss, all by himself on the sidewalk. He was vomiting right in public, said Faye. Why did I have to be shown that? Where you come from, the driver said scornfully. This here is Mardi Gras night. So what about those two different versions? Joellen, you want to talk about the baby in the diaper, or will I let you off the hook?
I think there are a few details like that planted, I think, more in the New Yorker, where something is really a little, odd. And the baby in the diaper, to some extent, I think is replaced by the fellow in the Spanish moss suit. I can't remember what occurs where and which one, but the baby, to me, signals just how out of control Mardi Gras is, and to some extent ups to the social level the Dalzells, and I mean just different kinds of behavior that seem. I'm just rambling here. Sorry.
Well, certainly the whole idea of carnival and of this breakdown of order and of this revelry and chaos is really important here, I think. And the baby is gone, but Faye does comment on things that she doesn't comment on before. There's longing and anger when she sees Death and Medusa. And then there's why did I have to be shown that when she sees the man vomiting, but the baby is gone. So yeah, Teresa, what do you think?
My take on this is that Faye is really an innocent. That's pointed out with her golden white hair, her frail physical frame, as well as her very white and pale skin. So Faye, I don't think, has been exposed to a lot of worldly things. And again, that's a class issue. Laurel has. And for Faye, escaping Texas and marrying Judge McKelvey was her big getting upped in life. And all of these things, the bad things that she sees aren't helping her to become more worldly. And so she's frustrated, she's angry because she really knows that she's living on borrowed time to get all this world experience that she hasn't gotten.
Yeah, she wants to be in the carnival. That's what she's wanted all along. Get up and take me to the carnival. And when she sees the death, I think you're right. There's an innocence and there's that desire for this kind of experience, expansion of experience. But when she sees Death and Medusa, it's either longing or anger. I've been denied this, or I want to be out in it, but she doesn't see them as Death and Medusa. And those are really striking figures, I think, for Welty. And this Judge McKelvey has died. I think Laurel sees Faye as a kind of Medusa who's turning men to stone here. But Faye doesn't see that. There's not that kind of comprehension. But when the Spanish moss man is vomiting, it's why did I have to be shown that? There's that son of self that, protect me. Monica, I think I see you with comments poised on your face. Am I wrong? Monica Miller.
I was coughing.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were ready to talk.
No, I mean, I always love it, you know, when Medusa shows up in any of these stories. Yeah. I hadn't thought about whether Laurel sees Faye as Medusa, but I really like that there with death. Yeah. And also, this is a great time to be reading this, right? With Mardi Gras having just been last week.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. This is still so recognizable.
So, I mean, I think there is that Faye longing. There's Faye longing for experience, longing for this, but not really knowing what she's seeing, perhaps. And Faye focused on herself. Why did I have to be shown that? And not seeing the dark side of the revelry or the consequences of revelry. So all of that, I think, is coming into play. Yeah. Harriet and Joellen and Cheryl.
I wanted to change the topic a little bit, but before we end, but there was a couple hands up, so don't lose the topic. Come back to it. I just wanted to say that before we finish, I wanted to pay attention to the fact that Welty adds the detective fiction in the hospital. That the books that she chooses to read at first are detective fictions, and she thinks how the judge can't keep up, and that it's Nicholas Nickleby in the short story. I'm thinking about I'm being Sarah Ford right now. Sarah's not here, so I think today I couldn't see her in the gallery, but I'm thinking about her sense that that the whole first part of the novel is, in a sense, a kind of murder mystery that Laurel is trying to write as she is presenting Faye as murderous in her thoughts and trying to work it out that way. And Sarah has a wonderful reading, paying attention to the body in the library, Agatha Christie, as a kind of parallel to read a parallel plot to what's happening in Welty's construction, and then the mystery gets more complicated, and then the mystery is not the Agatha Christie kind, but something more complicated, and Sarah's really good on that. But I'm thinking about, of course, the way in which Justina Welty was a great mystery reader, and that the parent that she's lost, that she might have read mysteries to, would have been her mother.
Yes, and of course, Eudora, a great mystery reader. And Eudora, who in 1970 praised Ross MacDonald in an interview with the New Yorker, and then shortly after that began a correspondence with him, and then met him in 1971, and then writes some scenes in the novel in response to their letters. And so here is the mystery writer. She might have been thinking of the contemporary one, and that might be another prompt for the reference to mysteries and to reading it as a mystery. Okay, Joellen.
I was going to say something about the polarities, or polarity indicated by the baby in death, and link that to other examples in Welty, and more broadly just to how she uses children in this, but that can wait. I can't resist Harriet's
and Teresa's a comment about Faye is innocent, and Faye like the child.
Sure.
Yes,
yeah,
right.
yeah. And the judge seems like a child playing hide and seek when Laurel sees him. So there are all kinds of references. But I want to just comment on the fact that not only does the mystery novel not appear, but Laurel is not even reading to her father at first. So there are different kinds of reading experiences here. And that, just before we leave, I want to plant a seed, maybe for next time, about the fact that we're reading this in the pages of a magazine. Welty commented one time when, I don't know whether Dermot Russell tried to sell The Robber Bridegroom to the Ladies' Home Journal, but she imagines the robber bridegroom drinking all the alcohol and assaulting all the ladies in the novel. And I really did. I've done a little work on that before, but think about the surround. There are a couple of things in here that are hilarious. On page 38, there's a cartoon where the father is recommending that his daughter not speed read Elizabeth Barrett Browning. There's another one that could be kind of an in-joke for us on page 39, where Cat is leading obedient birds. in order. So those are kind of fun, but more generally, I noticed that the only ads and poems are in the first section. After that, things broaden out and the magazine thinks we've been hooked. And only toward the end do we get only text in the middle panel. And so we're really being teased by all of this stuff around us, some of the stuff which we'd be familiar with from reading about New Orleans. That's all.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting, the surround of the story when it is in a magazine like the New Yorker. Yeah. So maybe we can talk about that next time. Anything else? I also wanted to mention masking, the whole idea of masking, which comes up in the carnival section, and the masking that Faye does, and the masking that perhaps Laurel does as well. So we're out of time. Anyone want to say something profound before we leave? Well, I'm glad that I can now. Oh, Beverly, good. Here we go.
This isn't profound, but everybody who's ever been to New Orleans, whether it was for Mardi Gras or just on a weekend night, probably had a similar reaction to Faye's. I mean, if you can get out of there without having somebody throw up on your feet, it's been a good night. Yeah. So, as I read that, I was thinking her reaction wasn't all that different from mine the first time I went. I'm much more accustomed to it now, but it's not an unusual reaction.
No, I think that what's unusual about it is, why did it have to happen? Well, maybe it's not unusual to me, but it's Faye's typical focus upon on herself, because it's happening to everybody. Yeah, and part of it. Okay. Well, I apologize for my technical difficulties. I'll try not to have a repetition of that. And we will talk next time about parts 3 and 4 of the New Yorker version in comparison with parts 3 and 4 of the novel. Thank you all. Bye-bye.